As I said, we'll hold the questions until a later session. So I'd like to ask Dr. Wouter Henkelman to join us, but first a few words. Wouter is the Associate Professor for Elamite and Achaemenid Studies at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. He's also a Research Associate at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, where he's working on a large group of Elamite clay tablets from Persepolis. In 2008, he produced a monograph, The Other Gods Who Are, a book that questioned the genesis of Persian identity, which is one of Dr. Henkelman's primary research interests. He's taught early Iranian history all over the world in Leiden, Amsterdam, Innsbruck, Istanbul, Paris, Oxford, and very shortly in Tehran. So we're delighted that we were able to catch him to come to Washington. Wouter, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Julian, for those very flattering words again. And also my thanks to Nancy and to Alex for inviting me to this august occasion. I will be talking about the identity of the early Persians, and in that context about Cyrus the Great. And I will sort of pick up where Amélie and John left us, talking about some aspects of the Cyrus cylinder, and also about the question, aren't Iranians, past and present, allowed to think of Cyrus and his supposed human rights policy what they want? Isn't it part of their own constructed identity that they are entitled to have? I just show you briefly the Persian Empire, also to stress this point that was raised earlier, that Cyrus conquered this entire world empire within 11 years. And of course, when you think of that a little bit longer, you must realize that you cannot do that simply like that in 11 years without a long prehistory that enables a nation, that enables the Persians to be ready to do this. And this is actually the field that I have been focusing on. But first, just to prepare you for what I'm going to say, a very brief anecdote. This is the envoy sent by Napoleon to the Raja court in Iran. And there's an anecdote about this guy. When he introduced himself to the Shah of the Persians, he tried to flatter the Shah, saying, "It must be so wonderful to be the successor of Kurush and Dariush," upon which the Shah replied, "Who on earth are these people?" It tells you something, and it is actually more than an anecdote, because Cyrus and Darius are not part of the epic tradition of Iran. They became part of Iran's identity again under the last Shah, or under the last two Shahs, I should say. So what do we know about Cyrus really? And as you know, I've been asked to talk about his role in the Greek tradition and in the Iranian tradition, and I have only 15 or 20 minutes, so I should be very brief. As Amélie already told us very clearly, the Greek accounts about Cyrus are all written much later after his reign, and they are for various reasons distorted in various directions. One thing, however, that occurs again and again in our sources is the story about the birth of Cyrus. There are at least 6 versions of it known to the classical world, and I suspect that there were many more. Because this, the motive of a child exposed in the wilderness, suckled by a wild animal, found and raised by poor people, and in the end claiming his rightful throne, is of course a well-known and widespread motif. You know that it has been told, for instance, about Moses, but also about Romulus and Remus, and about Queen Semiramis, and about hundreds of other mythical and historical figures. The fact that this story was so popular in the classical world probably indicates that it was widely told in the Persian Empire as well. That again doesn't tell us much about Cyrus as a personality or as a historical figure, but it does tell us a little bit about how Persians at the time of Herodotus and Ctesias thought about the founder of their empire. So this is actually a quite precious look into Persian identity in the later 5th century BC. And I should add that this story told about founder kings has a kind of messianistic overtone. Because normally when you expose a baby in the wilderness, wild animals will not take care of it. They will eat it. That this particular child, this royal child, which has a mission, survives, already indicates his benign reign. It already indicates what a wonderful king he will be. This is the messianistic promise which is at the core of this story. Again, it doesn't tell us anything about the personality of Cyrus, but it does tell us about how Persians in antiquity thought about him. Now let's go to the Persian heartland, the region of Persepolis and Pasargadae, the last one, of course, the residence built by Cyrus. And I should now briefly introduce to you the two dynasties that ruled the Persian Empire. You may be surprised that I say two dynasties, but nowadays most of my colleagues agree that there's not one but two dynasties. First, the one to which Cyrus belonged, and then the one to which Darius the Great, belonged. There is, of course, a link between them because Darius married two of the daughters of Cyrus when he took power in the Persian Empire under circumstances that have never been completely clarified in around 520 BC. Now, interestingly, these two dynasties, as has been argued, seem to have different cultural profiles. At least this is what some people say. Some people say that Cyrus's dynasty is more oriented towards an Elamite past. And I should explain to you, Elam and Elamite culture were at home in southwestern Iran. They had had states, a succession of states, since the late 3rd millennium BC, a very, very long history. And there are some elements, indeed, in the dynasty of Cyrus that look Elamite. I personally don't believe that there was such a cultural change, and I do believe that there are Elamite elements as well in the succession in the later dynasty of Darius. But let me focus on Cyrus now. In the cylinder, he calls himself king of the city of Anshan, and he also gives us his genealogy, listing all his predecessors as kings of Anshan and as descendants of one Theispes, who is also known from Herodotus as the ancestor. And in other inscriptions left by Cyrus, Ansan or Ashan is also mentioned. Although there the incorrect spelling or the imprecise spelling of the name of Anshan suggests a less precise knowledge, I would say, of the titles of Cyrus. So now I will try to go into these elements because I think if anything points to Cyrus in the Cyrus cylinder, it's his title and his genealogy. I completely agree with Amélie Court that otherwise the Cyrus cylinder is a Babylonian document, which was written according to Babylonian masters and Babylonian examples. But I do think that Cyrus gave, that his aides gave the titles and the genealogy that the king wished. This is a seal impression on a tablet found in Persepolis, and this particular seal impression is from a seal that had an inscription, and the inscription reads, Kurash of Ansan, son of Sheshpesh. And this has been universally recognized as the seal of the grandfather of Cyrus the Great, the son of Sheshpesh, in agreement with the genealogy given in the Cyrus cylinder. Now, one of the interesting things that one could say about this is that the genealogy given by Cyrus the Great in the Cyrus cylinder actually might have been inspired by this seal. This was a seal kept in the dynasty of the Theispids and later given to the dynasty of Darius, the Achaemenids. It was still used in court circles. It was a very highbrow, exposed seal, visible to all in the royal court. So it was thought of as an important heirloom, and it might have been instrumental in constructing the genealogy given by Cyrus in the Cyrus cylinder. However that may be, we should talk about why Cyrus chose this title, King of Anshan, and also what we can say about his name. Cyrus, often quoted as the father of the Iranian nation, founder of the First World Empire, but also earlier in the 20th century as the founder of the First Aryan Empire. Let's not forget that the name of Cyrus is intimately linked to that period of our more recent history. And related to that, people have sometimes desperately tried to find an Iranian etymology of the name of Cyrus. There are some possibilities listed here, none of which is very convincing, though, for the simple reason that we have another version of the name, not Kurush, but Kurash. Now, I won't dwell too long on linguistical details, but just to give you a brief insight in how these things work, if you have two forms of the name, a linguist will be very happy, because with two forms, you can argue which of the two forms is older, and based on that, you can find an etymology. So if you have Kurash and Kurush, one of them has to be the original form, the other has to be the adapted form. So imagine that it is an Iranian form. In the Old Persian text that we have, he's called Kurush. Imagine that is the original form. Why would you adapt that to Kurash in Akkadian and in Elamite? Because there's not such a thing as an ending on ash in Elamite. There's not such a thing as an ending on ush in Elamite or in Akkadian. Are Elamites unable to say ush? No. There are many names on ush in Elamite. Think of the inverse. If Kurash is the original form, would you have a problem with that in Iranian? Yes, you would, because you don't have A stems ending with final shin, final S in Old Iranian. The final S in that position has disappeared in Old Iranian languages. So you couldn't say Kurash in Iranian, so you would have to adapt it. And the closest thing would be the U stems, and that would give you Kurush. So even without knowing the etymology, a priori, it is more logical that the name is Elamite than Iranian. And indeed, and this has been proposed actually already in 1904 by Andreas, who was not taken very serious at the time when he said so. But there is a good etymology for it. And actually it is a name that agrees to a pattern that you see quite a lot in this age. It is an abbreviated name where the divine name has been left out, and that should be read as God X has protected or has bestowed care. On the pattern of another example, Shirash, God X has commanded. And according to the same pattern, you can explain the name of Teispes, Sheshpesh in Elamite. That is the same pattern with a reduplicated base. So as I said, I won't dwell too long on these things, but of course it's very interesting to see that these people had Elamite names. Does that mean that they were Elamites? Not at all. Identities are something very complex, and you cannot tell anybody's identity just by his name. But it does tell you something about the cultural orientation of this time, which is something important. Two major residences of the Achaemenids, Susa and Persepolis, they reflect a situation of highland and lowland in South Iran, a duality that existed for millennia before. In those preceding millennia, the two capital cities were Susa and Anshan, and the kings of the Elamite kingdom and Elamite empire of the early second millennium called themselves proudly King of Anshan and Susa. And what, I will skip this for the moment. what do we find? Even in the last period of Elamite history, there still is a king who gives himself the grand titles of king of Susa and Anshan, and this king nowadays is dated actually to the reign of Cyrus. We now believe that there still was an Elamite king or vassal king in Elam at the time of Cyrus. So what does it mean when Cyrus calls himself king of Anshan? He actually takes half of that old Elamite title to give himself an historical precedent, to seem somebody who doesn't come new to the world, but who has a cultural history in Iran and a history that is known in Mesopotamia. There's a lot to be said about influences between the early Iranians and their Elamite predecessors, also in the arts. I unfortunately cannot dwell too long on that. I will just show you a recent find from the so-called Arjan tomb that has many different objects, including this big plate or bowl, a shallow bowl, I should say, and it has in 5 registers a sort of vision of an Elamite life, of an Elamite dynasty in this border zone between the lowland and the highland, which was very instrumental in fostering contacts between the early Persians and the Elamites. And I will rotate it for you. What you will see coming up is a tent. You see it's now below, and the ruler, the Elamite ruler, is sitting in front of the tent. So he identifies himself as somebody who lives or has a tent. But in the second register, you see coming up now a citadel, and the same ruler is sitting in front of the citadel. So this is a person who identifies himself as having a citadel or fortress or a palace, but also a tent. This is a late Elamite image, and it strikingly reminds us of the Achaemenid kings who are known to be nomadic. The Achaemenid court was a nomadic court. They traveled from residence to residence, and they had massive, sumptuous tents on their travels between their residences. So this is, of course, very interesting for understanding Achaemenid culture. The Achaemenids used Elamite for their administration. And we have that on a massive scale from Persepolis. We have a few tablets from Susa. These Elamite archives covered enormous administrative regions, and we can construe from internal evidence other such administrative regions administrated in Elamite documentation for the entire western Iranian plateau. And there's even evidence for faraway Kandahar, Afghanistan. Even there, an Elamite administration was planted by the Achaemenids. So Elam and Elamite culture, Elamite traditions were really very important for the Achaemenids. So why I am saying this in the context of Cyrus? Well, let me give you a counterexample to show you what is the problem here. This is the seal of one of the regional directors within the Persepolis economy. And he uses an old seal, an heirloom seal, like the one I just showed to you before. And it has an inscription by a person with an Elamite name and an Elamite patronym. And when these tablets became known and were studied by a person called Richard Hallock, a colleague of his, Wouter Henkelman, in Göttingen in Germany, was interested in knowing the inscription on this seal for various reasons. So he wrote to Hallock saying, could you tell me what is on this seal inscription? So Hallock wrote him back saying it's an Elamite inscription naming 2 Elamite individuals. And then, so here they are, excuse me. And then Wouter Henkelman wrote back to Hallock about this seal and about its owner, who has a Persian name, I should add. And he says, in German here, I will translate it for you, incredibly that Ershena, with a Persian name, has inherited his seal from an Elamite. This is the perspective that has pervaded my field for a very long time. This modernly constructed clash between Elamites and Iranians based on the idea that the advance of the Iranians into Iran brought something fundamentally new, a new religion, a new culture, an Indo-Iranian culture, if not an Aryan culture. For Hinds, it certainly was an Aryan culture, a better culture, absolutely a better culture. And to make these things worse, I should introduce to you the fact that, as everywhere in Iran, there has been a lot of theory about race of the different cultures that played part in its history. Now, in the 19th century, research on race was quite a different thing, of course, than in the 1930s. So I just quote this to show to you that there were these ideas that the Elamites were somehow black, or a mixture of white and black races. That's all fine for the 19th century, but Wouter Henkelman writes in 1964, seeing these famous guards from the palace in Susa, built by the Cyrus, that obviously, to him at least, I can't see it, but he could see it, 3 different races are depicted here, and he says from the third, who in his view is a white person, clearly a Persian, because he is white. And the others are clearly Elamites because they are not white. So remembering this, think of this. He had to explain why the Persians, this noble new race, were using Elamite for their administration, and how could they control their clerks, because obviously the conquering race did not write itself. They had their servants to do that. But how could they control them if they didn't understand Elamite? Well, he came up with a theory for this. He said they, at their homes, it's indicated in red here, they had servants and nannies, Elamite servants and nannies who spoke Elamite, so they had some residual knowledge of Elamite because they had to speak with their servants. This, ladies and gentlemen, is South Africa projected on the Persian Empire. This is apartheid. This is apartheid. The Elamites are reduced to being servants and nannies, and there's no possibility of giving any meaningful contribution to the Persian culture, to Persian identity. And mind you, this is 1971. This is not 1931, this is 1971. In my perspective, this is quite recent, actually. So why to say this? This is because researchers like Wouter Henkelman and also like Wilhelm Eilers have been quite instrumental in forming the identity, the modern identity of Cyrus the Great. And they were quite actively involved in the celebrations that the last Shah organized in Pasargadi and in Persepolis in 1971, where again this purity was stressed, and for a good reason, because it was not only they who were following this policy. Under the Shah, there was a quite active policy of Persianization. Only 50% of the Persians at the time of the Shah spoke Persian, Farsi. There are many different languages in Iran and many different ethnic groups that always coexisted throughout Iranian history. The Shah, however, pushed very much Persian Aryan identity. The word Aryan was used quite a lot in those days. And now the point comes, I always feel a bit uncomfortable about this whole Cyrus business exactly because of this. It's not an innocent fantasy. It's quite the opposite, I would say. When they decided to celebrate 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy, as it was put, or Persian monarchy, there was, of course, a calculation in that. If you calculate back from 1961, the original date for the celebrations, you arrive indeed at 539 BC. So it means that everything before Cyrus doesn't belong to state structures or history or Persian identity. Iran's history, Persian history, starts with Cyrus the Great because he's the first Indo-Iranian ruler. Everything before that is not relevant. And this is the case because the Shah was pursuing this Persianization policy. Minority languages were suppressed. Minorities were curfewed under the Shah. There are many reports about this. So it's actually a quite worrying theme. And I should close by showing these pictures that we have seen yesterday. Obviously, it's wonderful that the BM was able to organize that splendid exhibition in the museum in Tehran. I won't say anything about that. But I do think that the current regime is using Cyrus in the same way that the Shah was using it. And it is indeed the case that under Ahmadinejad, a nationalist policy that was already mentioned by John Curtis has become much stronger again. And minorities, especially ethnic minorities, are more suppressed again under Ahmadinejad. And surprise, surprise, who has been abused again at this occasion? Cyrus the Great. So I would like to close off my short intervention today by asking a simple question. Should we really focus on this one person whose figure has been so much distorted that we will never be able to reach his real historical person? Is that what we really want to do when we want to celebrate Iran's wonderful culture and past? There's so much to be studied, so much cause for amazement when you know Iranian culture, Iranian history. And what strikes me when I was trying to come up with an alternative as the idea of Iran, when you look at all those centuries of different cultures coming into Iran, of different languages spoken there, different scripts used there, and always this adaptation, what strikes me as the idea of Iran, which I think we should really celebrate, is the possibility of synthesis, which has always existed. That is, for me, Iran. Thank you.
Wouter, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking talk.